When my husband died, people became casseroles. That's the only way I know how to explain it. For about 2 weeks after the funeral, faces blurred together into soft pity and Tupperware. Everyone suddenly spoke in the same gentle voice, touched my forearm too often, and said things like, "If you need anything at all." In the exact tone people use when they desperately hope you won't actually ask. I was 34, newly widowed, and so numb I could barely tell if I was hungry until I was already dizzy. So when my neighbor, Melissa, started showing up every other evening with food, I was grateful. At first, it felt like one of the few sincere things in a month full of performance. Melissa lived 3 houses down. Late 40s, divorced, no kids at home, always overly cheerful in that organized woman way that made me suspect she labeled her spice rack and had opinions about proper towel folding. We'd never been close, but she had that neighborhood energy where she somehow knew everyone's dog's name and what day the recycling changed last year. The first time she knocked, she was holding a foil tray of lasagna and wearing the expression of someone trying hard to look soft. "I made too much," she said. I almost laughed at the lie. No one accidentally makes grief lasagna. Still, I thanked her. I invited her in. She stayed for maybe 10 minutes, just long enough to compliment the framed wedding photo in the hallway, say my husband had always been such a kind man, and leave before the silence got awkward. 2 days later, she came back with soup. Then banana bread. Then enchiladas. Then a container of cut-up fruit I definitely hadn't asked for but ate standing over the sink at midnight like it was medicine. I started expecting her. Which, in hindsight, was probably the point. She never stayed too long. Never pushed. Just enough kindness to feel safe. Just enough presence to make me stop noticing how strange it was that she always seemed to arrive at moments when I was unraveling. The evening I broke down trying to carry in groceries. Knock at the door. Chicken pot pie. The afternoon I sat on the porch still wearing the same sweatshirt for the 3rd day in a row. There she was, holding muffins and concern. The night I finally took my husband's jacket off the hook by the door and cried so hard I threw up in the bathroom. She texted 10 minutes later. Made extra chili. Want some? I remember staring at the message through blurred vision and feeling, for the first time since Ethan died, something almost like comfort. It didn't occur to me until later to wonder how she always knew. At the 6-week mark, people mostly disappeared. That's another thing nobody tells you about grief. It doesn't just hurt because someone is gone. It hurts because everyone else eventually expects your pain to become quieter, tidier, more appropriate for daylight. There's a socially acceptable period for public devastation, and after that you become unsettling. Melissa didn't disappear. If anything, she became more present. She started offering to help with practical things. Need someone to bring the trash cans in? Need me to sign for a package if you're out? Need someone to recommend a plumber, a lawn service, a handyman? I said yes more than I should have, partly because I was exhausted and partly because saying yes made me feel less alone. One Saturday, she came over while I was sorting through a stack of mail and insurance paperwork. My husband had handled all our finances. I hated how incompetent widowhood made me feel, like grief had turned every envelope into a foreign language. Melissa sat at the kitchen table, reading over forms with me, and said, "Ethan was always so on top of everything." I smiled weakly. Yeah. He had passwords for his passwords. She laughed. Then she said, "Did you ever find the life insurance documents?" I looked up. I hadn't mentioned life insurance. Maybe she was guessing. Most married adults have some kind of policy. Still, the question landed oddly. "I think so," I said slowly. "Why?" She shrugged and tapped the stack of papers. "Just seems like the kind of thing you'd need quickly." I nodded, but something in me filed it away. Over the next couple of weeks, more tiny things started to bother me. She knew the brand of whiskey Ethan drank, even though she had never been inside our house while he was alive. She knew he had switched jobs the previous spring. She knew we'd been planning to repaint the guest room before he died. None of these were impossible for a neighbor to know. People notice things. Husbands mention jobs. Paint samples sit visible in garages. Whiskey bottles go into recycling bins. But each fact on its own was harmless. Together, they created a feeling I couldn't name. Then one Tuesday, she came by with lemon bars and asked a question that changed everything. "Have you thought about selling the house?" I actually laughed. "What?" She gave a quick embarrassed smile. "Not now, obviously. I just mean eventually. It's a lot of house for one person." It was true. Too true. A 3-bedroom colonial with a yard Ethan had loved and I barely maintained even before he died. Still, something about the way she said it felt less like sympathy and more like surveying. "I haven't thought that far ahead," I said. She nodded, but her eyes moved past me into the hallway, toward the stairs, in a way I didn't like. That night I mentioned it to my sister, Ava, over the phone. She had disliked Melissa from the second week, mostly on instinct. "She's too available," Ava said. I rolled my eyes. "That's not a crime." "No, but weird people always hide behind helpfulness." "Did Ethan know her well?" "Not really." "You sure?" I almost said of course. Instead I paused. "Why?" "I don't know," Ava said. "You keep describing her like she's orbiting your life on purpose." That annoyed me enough that I defended Melissa for a solid 5 minutes. Then, after I hung up, I sat in the dark living room and replayed the last month in my head. Orbiting was the right word. The next clue came from my trash. I know how that sounds. It was Thursday, pickup day. I was outside in slippers dragging the bin back up the driveway when I noticed the lid of the recycling container wasn't closed properly. A corner of paper stuck out from the top. I reached down absently to shove it in and saw it was one of my bank envelopes. Not junk mail. Opened mail. I froze. I never put open financial mail into recycling without shredding it. Ethan had drilled that habit into me years earlier after some identity theft horror story. I lifted the lid. Inside, mixed with soda cans and cereal boxes, were 2 opened envelopes from our mortgage company and one from the life insurance provider. I had not thrown them away. For a few seconds I genuinely questioned my own memory. Grief does that, makes you distrust your brain before you distrust other people. I took the envelopes inside and spread them on the counter. One had a date from 3 days earlier. I remembered opening it at the kitchen table, reading half of it, then leaving it in the deal with later pile near the coffee maker. Now it was in my recycling bin. That was the first time I felt fear. Not movie fear. Not someone is in the house fear. A quieter, more destabilizing kind. Someone has been touching my life when I'm not looking. I checked the doors. Locked. Windows. Fine. I went room by room anyway, feeling ridiculous and nauseous. Nothing was visibly wrong. That evening, Melissa texted. "Made baked ziti. Want me to drop some off?" I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "No thanks. Rough night. Going to sleep early." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Okay. Let me know if you need anything." I didn't sleep much. The next morning I called the non-emergency police line, then hung up before anyone answered. What was I going to say? My nice neighbor may be stealing my garbage and reading my mail after feeding me casseroles. It sounded unhinged. So instead, I bought 2 cheap security cameras online and installed them myself that afternoon, one pointed at the front porch, one hidden in the kitchen facing the back door and mudroom. I told no one. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third day, I left the house around 7 p.m. and parked around the corner instead of going to my grief support group. I sat in my car watching my own dark windows like a stalker in a procedural drama. At 7:26, Melissa walked up my driveway. She didn't knock. She took a key from her purse and let herself into my back door. I think my body moved before my mind did. 1 second I was frozen. The next I was halfway out of the car, then stopping myself because charging blindly into a possibly dangerous situation is how women end up as cautionary podcasts. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone while opening the camera app. Kitchen feed. Melissa entered carrying a foil-covered dish. She set it on the counter, looked around, then walked directly to the stack of mail by the coffee maker. I stopped breathing. She flipped through the envelopes quickly, selecting only a few. Then she opened a drawer near the fridge, the junk drawer where we kept spare keys, batteries, pens, rubber bands, and apparently, at some point, my trust, and pulled out a small notebook. Ethan's handwriting. I knew it instantly. Melissa opened it and began taking pictures with her phone. I called the police. This time I didn't hang up. By the time they arrived, she was still inside. I was standing at the end of my driveway in full view, crying from adrenaline and rage, when 2 officers walked in through my front door and found my neighbor in my kitchen holding my dead husband's notebook. Her explanation came quickly. Too quickly. Ethan had given her the key, she said. They had been friends. She was only trying to help me organize things because I was overwhelmed. The notebook contained contractor information, account reminders, and house details she thought I might need. She panicked when she heard police because she knew how it would look. The officers looked at me. Then at the open mail on the table. Then at the notebook in her hand. Then at the foil-covered dish she had apparently brought as burglary camouflage. One of them asked, "Ma'am, did you give her permission to be here tonight?" "No." "Did you know she had a key?" "No." Melissa started crying. I wish I could say that made me feel vindicated. It didn't. It just made everything uglier. The police didn't arrest her that night. Because she had a key and because there was enough ambiguity to turn the whole thing into a civil misunderstanding, they told me to formally trespass her from the property, document everything, and change the locks immediately. I barely heard most of it. My ears had snagged on one detail. Ethan had given her the key. After the officers left and Melissa was escorted back to her house, I sat on the kitchen floor until Ava arrived. She took one look at my face and stopped asking practical questions. Instead she said, "What aren't you saying?" So I told her. I told her the part one hadn't wanted to admit to myself. Melissa hadn't looked scared when the police entered. Not really. She had looked cornered. And guilty. Not guilty like a nosy neighbor. Guilty like someone whose version of events depended on the dead staying dead. Ava was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Do you think she was sleeping with him?" I hated how fast the thought fit. The next week became a blur of locksmiths, camera footage, and the slow excavation of a marriage. I found more than I expected. Deleted text records on the old iPad Ethan used at home because it still synced with his Apple account. Nothing explicit at first. Mostly messages about errands, house stuff, neighborhood updates. Then older ones. "Can you talk? She's still at work. I miss you already. Use the side door. I threw up in the sink." A full affair would have been devastating enough. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Melissa hadn't kept inserting herself into my grief out of kindness, guilt, or even obsession. She had been looking for something. It took me another 2 days to figure out what. Ethan's notebook wasn't a contractor notebook. It was a ledger. Not in any formal accounting sense. Just pages of tiny, obsessive handwritten notes. Payments, dates, account numbers, cash withdrawals, names abbreviated in ways only he would understand at first glance. And threaded through it all, one repeated reference, M. Followed by dollar amounts. At first I thought he had been giving Melissa money. Then I found the envelope. It was taped beneath the bottom shelf of Ethan's workbench in the garage, exactly the kind of hiding spot men in movies use because they think no one will ever check underneath anything. Inside were printed screenshots of bank transfers, a photocopy of a loan application, and one letter in Melissa's handwriting. It wasn't a love letter. It was a threat. If Ethan didn't keep helping her, she would stop protecting his family from the truth. I read it 6 times before the meaning settled. Melissa hadn't just been his affair partner. She had been blackmailing him. The truth turned out to be this. About a year before Ethan died, he had co-signed a private loan for Melissa's adult son, a man with a record, a gambling problem, and the financial judgment of a lit match in a fireworks store. The son defaulted almost immediately. Melissa panicked. Ethan stepped in, quietly paying parts of it so I wouldn't find out he had signed anything without telling me. Somewhere in the middle of that mess, boundaries collapsed and the affair started. Or maybe the affair started first and the money came after. At that point, sequence felt morally irrelevant. What mattered was this. After Ethan died, Melissa had been coming into my house not to comfort me, but to search for proof. Proof of the loan. Proof of the affair. Proof of the money. Anything that could expose her or drag her son into legal disaster. All those casseroles. All those soft-eyed check-ins. All that carefully measured kindness. She had been monitoring what I knew. The police took things more seriously after I brought them the letter and the footage. Still, it wasn't the dramatic criminal takedown people fantasize about. Real life is slower and more bureaucratic. Statements. Copies. Timelines. A lot of waiting in bland rooms. Melissa moved out 3 months later. No goodbye. No casserole. Just a for sale sign and shuttered blinds. I heard through another neighbor that her son had been arrested on unrelated charges in another county. I never confirmed it. By then I was exhausted by truth and what it cost to uncover. The strangest part of the whole thing is that I still sometimes miss the first version of Melissa. Not the real one. The one I thought existed. The woman on my porch with soup and sympathy. The woman who seemed to arrive exactly when I needed someone. The woman who made grief feel, for a few minutes at a time, less lonely. But loneliness is what made her dangerous. Grief stripped me down to appetite and trust. She fed both. That's what I think about now when people say, "At least you found out." As if discovery is the happy ending. I found out my husband betrayed me. I found out my neighbor was searching my house. I found out kindness can be a costume tailored perfectly to your weakest moment. That isn't closure. It's just clarity. Still, clarity has its uses. I sold the house the following spring. Not because Melissa had ruined it. Not because Ethan had poisoned every room. But because I had spent too long living inside a version of my life built by other people's secrets. Last month, in the apartment I chose myself, with furniture no one lied on and keys no one copied, I made lasagna from scratch for the first time since Ethan died. Halfway through layering the noodles, I started laughing. Really laughing. Because grief had once arrived in foil trays from a woman smiling on my porch, and for a while I mistook being fed for being cared for. Now when someone asks if I need anything, I tell them the truth. No casseroles. No spare keys. No help sorting paperwork. Just honesty. That would have been enough.